and I would love to welcome you here today. My name is Lindsay Stevens. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Strengthening the Teaching Profession, and I'm just really excited to welcome you here this morning. I taught for 15 years and was a new to career teacher mentor for 2 years, and I will tell you that I really wish that I had Yemi's work and the work that they're going to talk about today in my life then. I think that it would have transformed everything. So when I go back in the classroom, you know, I'm going to be following all of this. Put me in, coach. I can't wait. So I think this is a transformative experience and transformative information for everyone. So I'm going to just say welcome. I'm going to turn it over to Sue Anderson from OSPR to talk a little bit about how the residency models came to be and the inspiration for this work.
Thanks, Lindsay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday morning. Hope it's lovely where you are. And I really appreciate you being here with us this morning. So I'd like to welcome you to this leadership lab with Dr. Adeyemi Stembridge and teachers, coaches, school and district administrators who've had a chance to work with him over the past couple of years as he's been doing work in our state. And I'd also just like to say thank you to Lindsay and to Aaron and Stephanie at C-STEP for the work that they've done this year to share Dr. Stembridge's work with folks around the state through residencies, leadership labs, book studies, a number of different activities. Really excited about that. So I first had the opportunity to hear Dr. Stembridge at the WIRA conference in, I think we determined it was 2018. And he was one of our keynote speakers. And he was talking about some teachers with whom he had been working in residency situations. One of them was a first grade teacher whose goals for her students were for them to become word detectives and reading advocates. And he had her students were on screen explaining what that meant to them and how they were word detectives and what it meant to be a reading advocate. There were middle school math students who were on screen talking about what they'd learned about the importance of productive struggle and what that was. And there were high school world history students who had been learning about the root of conflict as a lack of empathy, and how does that apply in different both situations in history and also in the world, in our current world. So listening to these learnings was, for me, just an epiphany. It was revolutionary to think about classrooms that were taking on learning that matters in a very coherent way. It was places where students were seen as asset-filled beings. Their cultural identities were being honored. They were engaged in rigorous, engaging learning experiences about important learning targets. And they were part of a classroom culture in which every student had a sense of belonging and empowerment. Students were clearly at the center of these classrooms in the planning and in the instruction and in the assessment of what it was that they were learning, you know, big ideas, things that mattered. And it made me reflect a lot on I guess I would say on some of the learnings that some of the systems that we have in place in our state were actually supporting, that were not learnings of this great importance that students would remember years down the road. So it really, I think, was an important moment for me. And so it was wonderful when Nasue Nishida, who had been at C-STEP at that time, and I reached out to Yemi and said, could you work with us in Washington? And he'd already been working with the Vancouver School District for several years. And so we've we started some work 2 years ago, statewide work, and have been continuing this year, and we'll be continuing the work next year. And we're just really, really grateful that we have this connection, that we have someone who can really share with us some of the key key tenets and a wonderful framework for culturally responsive pedagogy. It's been very important. So today you're going to have a chance to hear from Dr. Stembridge, as well as teachers and principals and district administrators who've had a chance to work with him. And we know they have really important insights to share with you today, and you're going to have the opportunities to hear from them and also to ask them questions and also to hear from Dr. Stembridge. So I have to say that, I've been an educator for many years, and this has been some of the most, perhaps the most impactful work that I've had the opportunity to be connected with. So I'm so happy that you are making the time in your day to learn more about this. And I'm grateful to the people who are part of this work today and willing to share it with their colleagues across the state, to affirm the things that they're already doing that are so culturally responsive, and also to perhaps show some additional things that might be open to them as they work with students and with teachers. So, and with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Stembridge.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Yemi. I'm super happy to be here with you this morning. I really very much appreciate those kind words from Sue Anderson, who I think of as one of the most important partners that I'm having in my career in terms of trying to live my professional purpose, and my professional purpose is to help teachers. I have a planning session later today with the teacher in a residency in Vancouver Public Schools. I had a planning session yesterday. It is not normal how excited I get when I'm planning with the teacher and the teacher's making connections that I believe are going to translate into a rigorous and meaningful learning experience for kids. It doesn't make sense. Yesterday, I almost asked this teacher when we planned this lesson yesterday if I could just teach it myself, but I knew that would be rude and inappropriate and defeating the purpose of my thought partnering with her. But very appreciative to Sue, and then also to my colleagues at C-STEP, whom I've come to appreciate very much, Lindsay, Aaron, and I don't see Stephanie here today, but Stephanie as well. Just, really very happy to find, professional soulmates who I think are interested in doing the same kind of work that I'm trying to do. Some of you are familiar with the book that I wrote, Culturally Responsive Education in the Classroom, an Equity Framework for Pedagogy. We're going to be talking about some of that today, some of the ideas in that book. I'm working on another book right now, The Art of Culturally Responsive Education in the Classroom, Equity, Opportunity, and Pedagogy. And here's the thing about writing a book. I really, there's something about the immersive process of writing a book that really speaks to me. I tell people, you don't write a book in kind of fragmented episodes. You write a book with your whole life. And so the process of writing a book requires, I think if it's going to be a good book, it requires some soul searching and some kind of deep investigation of your own motives in terms of putting some kind of a statement out into the world. And you can tell if you're a reader like me, right? You can tell when you're reading a book that was written by someone who was present, and when you're reading a book who was written by someone who was trying to meet a kind of a deadline. So when I'm working on this book and working on the book that we're kind of talking about here today, Culturally Responsive Education in the Classroom, what I'm very aware of are the questions that drive my inquiry. Again, heard some really kind words from Sue. I would just say that, basically everything that I've learned about teaching, I've learned from teachers. So I've just been, kind of like a pedagogical bumblebee. I've had the opportunity to bounce around across the country and in many states and many classrooms to try to get a sense of what's working for students. And as I'm working on this book right now, I've been revisiting some of these overarching questions that I've been asking over the course of my career and my life. And there are really three questions that are kind of coming together in a profoundly kind of material way that I hope will lead to a book that is useful for teachers. This question of what is a good school? What is a good school? That's one of the first questions that I started to ask once I gained an initial understanding of what it is we mean by equity. One of my own father died when I was a kid, and the person who was nearest to a father figure to me as an adult was my mentor and the former dean of the School of Education at American University, where I did my doctoral work. And he wrote several books, and one of the books he wrote was called Good Schools: The Policy Environment Perspective. He wrote this book in 1995, and I met him in 1998. And in Good Schools, by the way, one of the things that he talked about is this idea of what he calls, TPA, Teacher Professional Authority. And one of the things he surmised in the book, from an immersive qualitative methodological approach, he learned that the schools that were most likely to be good schools are schools in which teachers have an active role in contributing to the capital P policy environment. So that was one of the things. Another big thing from that book was that that I learned methodologically, because I'm also very much interested in methodology, in research methodology. He talked about how to really understand the culture of a school, you have to assume some level of insider status. You cannot understand the culture of anything from the periphery, because to try to understand the culture of any group or any space from the sidelines is really an exercise in your superimposing your cultural values onto another cultural space. And that will always yield a misinterpretive output. So the question of what is a good school, ultimately for me, my simple answer to the question of what is a good school is, this is a school where I'd be comfortable sending my own child. We could say more about that maybe later, right? And then this other question of what do brilliant teachers do? What is it? I used to think in terms of master teachers, but then I realized, no, mastery is that's a less than ideal way for me to conceptualize the kind of teaching I'm looking for. Mastery for me kind of, it implies that that mastery is kind of like climbing a mountain and then staking your flag at the top of the mountain. But brilliance is something more like a marathon. And to be brilliant, I have some days where I am more or less brilliant than others. And so my question became, well, what is it that brilliant teachers do? But then there's this other question. I'm very proud, very happy to be from the Bronx, New York, but I also had a childhood where I was exposed to a lot of trauma and a lot of violence. And I came to understand later on in my adult life that it was the violence that had kind of stained me in a certain way. And I'm an African-American person, very happy to be African-American. And within the African-American community, there has historically been a stigma around therapy. And so I'm a Black person here saying to all my fellow Black people and all my fellow brothers and sisters in the human race, therapy is a good thing. You got to find a good therapist. Not all therapists are necessarily the best therapists, but I was able over the course of my adult life to find some therapeutic approaches through therapy that helped me to engage this other big question in my life, which is how am I warding off the depression and the anxiety that stems from the emotional trauma of my youth? And for me, the therapeutic methodology that I've found to be most productive is cognitive behavioral therapy. And if you're not familiar with it, cognitive behavioral therapy, I mean, like just really, really brief terms, right, it's an investigation on the intersection of your thoughts, your behaviors, and your emotions and how they reinforce each other to perpetuate certain thought patterns. And what I learned in my own therapy as an adult was that my trauma was attempting to speak to me. And my trauma, some of the same tools that I had used to survive a traumatic youth were tools that were undermining my well-being as an adult. And so I had to create a little bit of space And, in cognitive behavioral therapy, there are intersections with the field of neuroscience, where if you're familiar with my work, I'm a big fan of cognitive scientists. I have my own top 5 favorite cognitive scientists. My second favorite cognitive scientist is Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she wrote a book called How Emotions Are Made. Highly recommended. I think that book came out in maybe 2016, maybe 2017. She's got a book that's out right now called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, which is I recommend this book to everyone who's a teacher or a parent. She boils down these really complex cognitive scientific understandings of how the brain works, really how the brain interacts with the neurobiology of human beings in order to produce these kind of emotional and intellectual frameworks that we use to make sense of the world. The brain, when you just kind of bring it all down to the simplest statement that you can make, the brain is a predicting machine. That's what the brain exists for. The brain exists to predict, based on the stimulus of our environment, what is likely to happen so that you can make the appropriate decisions to survive and to protect yourself. This quote here from a recent podcast. Every podcast that Lisa Feldman Barrett does, I dial into it. This quote just came from a recent podcast she did. "The best available evidence is that your brain is constantly cultivating your past for the purpose of predicting your future, which will become your present." I'm bringing you back to, I sent a link for the handouts in the chat, so check those out. In those handouts, I've given you a partial list of what I learned about in cognitive behavioral therapy, these cognitive distortions. And so these are some of the, kind of hijackings that can take place in otherwise more reasonable and rationalizing processing. And what I had to learn, I'm not going to tell you what my go-to cognitive distortions were, but I have some. And even this morning, I felt it, right? And I mean, this is things that I've been thinking about and awareness that I've gained over more than a decade. And even this morning, I was ordering some breakfast from my local. There's a place here in Denver called Bird Call, which is a little bit like Chick-fil-A, and it's right down the street from my house. And I'm trying to order on my app, and then I'm trying to order through their website, and it's not going through. And I felt the cognitive distortions kicking in. And essentially, right, it's like my brain wanting to tell me that Bird Call is aligned with the entire universe to pick on you. And what I've learned in my my processing and my therapy over the years is to create a little space. To create a little space between that thought and my consciousness, because sometimes I just need to interject a robust, "That's not true. That's not true. The app just sucks. The universe isn't picking on me," and that can save me a great deal of suffering. So I would encourage you to check this out. So there's a parallel here that I'm trying to highlight, which is this parallel between therapy and the questions that I had about how to preserve and improve my own mental well-being, and research. Cognitive behavioral therapy and research are both methodological approaches to investigating what is a justified belief and discerning what is a justified belief from what is an opinion, an unwarranted, unkind of substantiated, less rigorously defined opinion. The goal of cognitive behavioral therapy in the methodological sense is to improve the skill of our thinking. Skilled thinking, which meets epistemological demands, regardless of the vested interests or ideological commitments of the thinker. There's a link there. If you click on epistemological, it'll take you to a page that kind of describes that. Epistemology, again, this process of discerning, this process through which we can, discern justified beliefs from what are, again, unsubstantiated, less than rigorously defined opinions. You know, and also there's another point that I'll make here about these cognitive distortions, and this could be a whole different talk, and I'm actually working on some pieces about this right now. Beware of mass-marketed cognitive distortions. Like once you begin to recognize what a cognitive distortion is, and how it can play out in your own individual thinking, then you are better positioned to look for the distribution of these cognitive distortions in broader society, which can also often be disguised as a kind of intellect. You know, again, here I'm pointing to this intersection of my own growth and well-being and some of the things that I've learned in therapy and my identity as a researcher, and understanding cognitive distortions in the way that I do. This is why I'm very careful to not knowingly use deceitful arguments, even for a cause as just as equity. I'm pausing there to let that sink in there. I just said a whole lot. And there's a lot more that we could do with that statement, but we'll come back for that a little bit later. So I'm back to my questions, right? So what is a good school? And what is it that brilliant teachers do? I have been enormously blessed with these, just brilliant mentors. I just told you about my mentor and friend, Charlie Tesconi. He died in September of 2020. Some people have really smart mentors. My mentor was wise, and there's a beautiful kind of difference there. And so this question of what is a good school? What do brilliant teachers do? This has led me to thinking very carefully about equity broadly. And over the years, really starting in about 2008, I really became infatuated and committed to this idea of culturally responsive education. Once I became familiar with the work of the matriarchs of culturally responsive education, who I write about briefly in the book, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Lisa Delpit, Geneva Gay, Sonia Nieto. I write about them in the book. I say briefly because the Rutledge made me cut out probably 2,500 words, 3,000 words about the matriarchs. I literally got a comment from one of the reviews, which was, "This is beginning to sound a lot like a lit review," to which my researcher response was, "And what's the problem with a lit review? Lit reviews are great. How dare you say something negative about lit reviews? Lit reviews are amazing." But then I realized, okay, well, that's not necessarily the best place for this thinking in this kind of a book. So the book that I'm working on now is it's centered around a thesis. I'm trying to bring together these ideas. I'm picking up on what I talked about in culturally responsive education in the classroom, and I'm extending the argument. I'm saying that equity is the highest goal of teaching. Teaching for equity is a function of creating opportunities that match the student's space and the moment. The craft of creating these opportunities is what we call pedagogy. And pedagogy, in the interest of equity, is a lot like making art. So when I started working on this book, I thought it was going to be a lot more about creativity, but I'm realizing it's not so much about creativity, it's about art making. And art making is, I'm going to argue, something that is a bit different in shape and form and tenor than pure creativity. Another little book that I love is a book called Art and Fear: Observations on the Perils and Rewards of Art Making. I have no idea how I came into contact with this book. I have no recollection of how it came onto my radar, but it's a book that I've read. I probably found it maybe 10 years ago, and it's kind of stayed on my shelf, and I've read it probably 5 or 6 times, and it's become one of the more influential texts in the work that I'm doing right now. And I love this quote. I'm going to read this quote. "Art making involves skills that can be learned. The conventional wisdom here is that while craft can be taught, art remains a magical gift bestowed only by the gods. Not so. In large measure, becoming an artist consists of learning to accept yourself, which makes your work personal, and in following your own voice, which makes your work distinctive. So the three key ideas in this book are equity, opportunity, and pedagogy. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to frame a conversation around these three big ideas and keep us connected to the social and material realities of teaching. This is the thing, teachers, that keeps us sane. You can never wantonly pursue some, fantastically undefined abstract concept because you have children to teach. And your children are real. And there are classrooms where you have to stay connected to reality. Otherwise, you will lose all credibility with the humans that you are teaching. This is a blessing, because I know many philosopher types in the academy who are not connected to the social and material realities of the world, and they wouldn't last 10 minutes in your classrooms. All right, so this is one of the things, again, why I remind people all the time that everything that I know, I've learned it from teaching and from teachers, because teachers keep me honest, they keep it real, and I can't, gloss over the questions, the challenges that they would bring to bear. So when I think about equity, again, that's the purpose of our work. The purpose of culturally responsive teaching is to remove educational disparities as a hindrance to the ethos of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We will know that we have achieved equity when neither race, nor class, nor income, nor gender, nor language background, nor physical disability, when no social disparity or measure of identity is a barrier to or predictor of educational achievement. This is the high goal, the paramount goal of our teaching. It's equity. We want classrooms and schools and learning spaces where every student has the fairest and most meaningful opportunity to be successful, which is a little bit different than equality. Equality means everyone has the same opportunity. Equity means that everyone has the fairest and most meaningful opportunity. And then I'm going to skip over opportunity for a second, and I want to go to pedagogy, because pedagogy is the craft. This is the thing that we do. I'm a pedagogical nerd. When I'm in a classroom and there's a teacher who's teaching brilliantly, I feel like I'm in the presence of a rock star on stage in their zone, right? And so when I'm talking about the craft of culturally responsive teaching, I'm talking about pedagogy that leverages the awareness of culture, race, ethnicity, gender, ability, and other social identity markers that shape the perceptions of educational opportunities in order to design learning experiences that allow students to draw on their backgrounds, identities, and cultural fluencies in the interest of learning. Another way for me to say that right is that the craft of culturally responsive teaching is the design of learning experiences in which students can be successful, not in spite of their backgrounds, but because of their backgrounds. And then I'm going to come here and I'm ending with opportunity. And so I'm thinking a lot about, opportunity, this word that I've always loved, this concept in terms of equity that I fell in love with thinking about back when I was a doctoral student at American University. And so, when we're talking about equity, there's this thing that we have to be careful about. Equity, by the way, folks, is not a new idea for those of you who have not been in residencies with me. Equity is an idea that's probably close to about 50 years old, maybe even a little bit older. Some of us are hearing about it recently for the first time, but this is a concept that's been very carefully thought about for many decades. And equity is measured by outputs, but we do not solve our equity problems by manipulating outputs. Equity is measured by outputs, but the answers to our problems of equity are reached through the re-engineering, the redesign of opportunity. So we measure equity through outcomes, but we address our equity problems through the re-engineering of opportunity. And so I think of opportunity as the product of culturally responsive teaching. And the product is empowered learning spaces where students learn and develop the tools to reach their goals. And so it cannot be empowering if it doesn't take into consideration the goals, the assets, the individual identities and stories of the students that we serve. And so now I'm thinking a lot about this idea of equity, because many of you who are familiar with my work know that one of the questions that I love to ask is about what do we want our students to feel? What do we want our students to feel? This teacher that I was just coaching yesterday, she said, I said, well, what do you want your students to feel in this learning experience? And she said, it might sound like a cop-out, but, I want my students to feel curious enough to investigate further. And I thought, yep, that's beautiful. I love that. And I don't think it's a cop-out if that is an overarching goal for the for what you want your students to feel. What I say to teachers is just make sure that you freshly consider that with every unit. Give yourself an opportunity to freshly consider and design how that goal for your students' curiosity is going to play out with every unit. Don't let that goal get stale. It's a beautiful goal. And then, of course, you have opportunities also to enhance and expand that goal for how you want your students to feel. For me, when I answer this question, how do I want my students to feel? I'm often thinking there's usually two words that come to my mind, and one is empowered and the other is inspired. And really, when you think about inspired is kind of just another way of thinking about what it is to be empowered. And so now I'm thinking a lot about, again, in this book, right? What is it that I want my students, what's the product of a culturally responsive learning experience that meets this highest purpose of equity? By the way, these pictures here are all pictures that I've taken or were taken with my iPad. Methodologically, I told you I'm a fan of methodology. One of my favorite methodological approaches in the social sciences is photoethnography. Google that if you're not familiar with it. There used to be, as a matter of fact, there was an ethnographic conference every year. It might still be going on at the University of Pennsylvania. And in one year, I and a couple of graduate students that I was working with, we submitted a photoethnography presentation based on work that we had done in the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans 18 months after Hurricane Katrina. And we learned a lot as a school was being reconstituted, an educational program was being reconstituted that had been very successful in the lower Ninth Ward. And we were there as they were putting it back together. And we presented this photoethnographic presentation to tell the story of the reconstituting of the culture of this school. One of the more rewarding projects that I've been a part of. I mean, frankly, I've had so many rewarding projects in my career. If I never have another rewarding project in my career, I won't complain, because I have been enormously blessed in that regard. So, but I'm showing you pictures because part of what I do in my instruction is, in my thought partnering with teachers is we'll look at pictures of students in learning experiences, and we use this as data. And then we'll ask, okay, when we see our students engaged, two questions I always love to ask is, what was working for students? And then what does that require of us? So my teachers who I've had a chance to work with, you know that I'm always encouraging teachers to think of yourselves as researchers in your classroom. And the data available to you in your classroom is your students' work and your students' thinking. So, so again, these are just some of the images that I've collected and used over the years in my planning spaces, my thought partnering spaces, to further unpack the efficacy of our approaches to pedagogy for the students that we're working with. I want to make a couple of points here before I turn this thing back over about what it is I'm currently thinking relative to empowerment. And I've got some raw notes here, not even necessarily all written in complete sentences. English teachers, please forgive me. Just trying to capture some thoughts here. And if you click on that link in your PowerPoint, what is empowerment, it'll take you to a fuller list of some of the ideas that I'm working on here, right? But again, I'm thinking of empowerment as a product of culturally responsive teaching. So that means we got to be really clear about what empowerment means. Empowerment, I think, means valuing self-efficacy and possessing a self-perception as competent and agential. An empowered person has a secure sense of themselves that offers a source of inspiration and energy for daring, exploration, risk-taking, and seeking challenge. It's an empowered space, an empowered product of our CRE design. What is empowerment? Abiding by a high epistemological standard and generally not shying away from incidents that may prove a held belief to be false. Fallibility in ideas and viewpoints is an accepted fact of life. The empowered student can go beyond subjectivity and self-interest, giving themselves over to the situation and embracing critique as opportunities to grow. Again, as I'm drawing from the evidence, the data that I've collected over the years from many classrooms in which I've been able to combine brains with teachers, right? This is part of what I'm thinking about as empowerment. What is empowerment? The capacity for cognitive and emotional empathy so that students can get along well with people from very different backgrounds and cultures and express their ideas in ways that other people will understand them. Skillful thinking that demonstrates the commitment to entertain multiple viewpoints sympathetically and to assess them with the same intellectual standards without reference to one's own feelings or vested interests or the feelings or vested interests of one's friends, community, or nation. I love how McTighe and Wiggins talk about empathy. They talk about the disciplined capacity to imagine what the world looks like from inside the head and the heart of another human being. What is empowerment? An empowered individual acknowledges social and material reality. This includes an acknowledgement of all aspects involved, people, places, times, and interaction according to one's goals or intentions. The empowered person is able to think pragmatically and values the knowledge of lived experience tempered by reason and situational observation. Thus, lived experience is understood as an aspect of fair-minded critical thinking, not its replacement. In other words, the empowered person knows that feeling a certain way does not necessarily reflect actual circumstances. What is empowerment? Optimism, tempered by realistic pessimism. A positive outlook is embraced not merely as wishful thinking, but as a pragmatic and necessary aspect of fair-minded critical thinking, for it opens the person to consider various ideas and viewpoints, whereas a negative outlook would close one off to new and innovative possibilities. An integrity and a place to stand that situates students as agents in the world in a way that will allow them to bring to the world what the world needs to be a better place. Optimism is the gas that can keep one going even in the face of very real obstacles and hurdles that would pretend to have the final say in their telling of their story. So what I want to do is I want to turn this back over. And again, I want to thank everyone for being here, all the teachers that I've had the chance to work with. You may not know it, but I learned something from every one of you every time we sit down and we think together about what's in the best interest of our students. And I'm really looking forward to hear about the connections that you're making and the work that we're doing. And I also just want to just as a side, just send a shout out to all the educators, all the teachers, coming toward the end of the hardest year in the history of the world to be an educator. If no one else tells you, let me tell you on behalf of all your students and their families, thank you, thank you, thank you for everything that you continue to do. Try not to mail it in for these last few weeks, right? Try to sprint across the finish line, okay? Because your students need you to be brilliant every single day. But if no one else is telling you this regularly, please know that I appreciate you. All right, that's it for me for now. And I'll have a chance to say something else a little bit later. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lindsay. I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Stembridge. I say it every time, but we've done quite a bit of work with Dr. Stembridge. I get to see and hear from him often, and I learn something every time. I write something down every time. So I'm just really excited when we get to hear from him and the way that he can really conceptualize and put into words some of the things that I think teachers we struggle with. I think so much about that art of teaching. The thing I say is we have to be able to articulate it to replicate it. And I think that's one of the great things that Dr. Stembridge does, is he really helps us articulate that. I love it. So we're going to move on with the rest of our schedule for the Leadership Lab. So Leadership Labs are designed to share information about practices, strategies, and ideas in a discussion format, with a typo, that participants can contextualize for their setting to support and grow practices that improve a wide range of outcomes for students and educators in their district. So that's kind of what we're getting at here in a leadership lab. Really what it is we want to spread this great work. So there's many of us that have read Yemi's book and kind of go, okay, so what does this look like? How do we make it go viral, as Sue likes to say? So that's sort of the point of this leadership lab, is to share this experience and take what we're hearing from him conceptually and the insight of those who have been through a residency, so that people can start to enact this in their classrooms and their systems. A residency, just to give you a little bit of background, we keep using that word. A residency is an opportunity that teachers have to come together and work with Yemi, where they work through his planning cycle and his 6 themes of culturally responsive education. He plans and partners with those teachers, like he was saying, planning tomorrow with some teachers, was planning yesterday with some teachers. And so then they teach the lesson. In actually last year we recorded, because we were virtual, and then sort of debrief that. So you really get this opportunity to work with Yemi, to take his mental model and his practices, to plan, engage, try it out, and iterate around that with his coaching right alongside you. So that is the opportunity that our educators will be reflecting on in this panel discussion. So we're going to start with a panel discussion and then move into some role-alike breakouts where you can ask more questions, and Yemi will visit those rooms as well, and just kind of think about, okay, what does this look like? What's that one piece I can take? You know, as educators, we always want to say, you know, what can I start doing tomorrow? And I think that the educators we're going to listen to and this experience will help you to know the answer to that question, so that you can start thinking and doing in this mental model and framework for culturally responsive education. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start asking the questions. I'm going to put the question up on the screen, and then I'm going to stop share after our panelists begin talking so that we can see their faces. So our panelists today, we have from Camas School District, Dr. Charlene Williams. She's the assistant superintendent. And so she'll be here talking about that administrative lens, that systems piece. We have Gunnar Guttormsen. He is a math coach in Kelso. And so he's bringing to us that coaching lens. How do I bring this to other educators? We have Noah Hall, also from Kelso. He is an English teacher there, so he'll be sharing that lens. And we have 3 teachers from Kent with us today. We have Angela Boston. She is a teacher in Kent. Anna Zimmerman is a 2nd grade teacher in Kent, and her colleague Elizabeth Helmer from Kent, who's also a 2nd grade teacher. And I will let them introduce themselves and just say hi when they speak for the first time, so we can kind of put a real life face to a name. Okay, so question 1, and I'm actually gonna move through the entire group for this question. We all just heard Yemi speak. Many of us have read his book or know of other works with him, maybe done the book study this summer, or have heard others talk about the power of his work. But for those who aren't intimately familiar with this work, how would you explain it? So a colleague says, hey, what's going on with this culturally responsive education thing? What would you say to them? So I'm going to go ahead and start with Dr. Williams. And so how would you explain this phenomenon to us?
Awesome. First of all, I'd just like to say I'm just really glad to be here. I'm grateful for the work that Dr. Stembridge is doing in classrooms around our state, especially the work he's done in Camas. Grateful to CSTEP for this opportunity. And I think it's time for true confessions a little bit around what this work really is, because two teachers in Camas actually introduced me to Dr. Stembridge's work. So I get a text from Mark Gardner, who actually sometimes writes for CSTEP and does other things around the state. And he's like, you know, I attended this training with some teachers in Vancouver, and you know, this gentleman has this book out. I think you might find it pretty interesting. He kind of gets straight to the teaching practices and such. And so I was like, okay. And I've had a history of, you know, working in districts and with consultants and educators. And sometimes when people say strategies, I kind of bristle a little bit, because I'm like, I hope those aren't decontextualized strategies, and that, you know, the importance of really understanding context is just really important to me. And so I'm like, okay, Mark, I'll check it out. And Mark is great about bringing many resources to me. And so I'm like, I'll add it to the list of things I'll get to. And then not too much later, I get another screenshot and text from Amy Campbell. Happened to be, and yes, I'm shamelessly name dropping, because yes, she was a teacher of the year for Washington from Camas. But you know, again, we're here because teachers do awesome work, and they are the ones who are who make this kind of thing go viral. And to honor their voices and to listen to them, I think is very important, especially from a leadership perspective. And so I'm like, okay, Mark's telling me, Amy's telling me, let me pay a little bit more attention. So I actually attended a leadership lab in the spring of last year because, you know, of that, and was like, okay, so he's the real deal. And even reading his book and how he's able to provide that rich context. He mentioned, you know, how he touches on the matriarchs of culturally responsive teaching and education, and just the brilliance of how he bridges the theoretical, the social political to classroom, as you just heard him eloquently describe. I think that it's so important to know that the work that Dr. Stembridge brings is both practical, but yet in an important context that we need to embrace and consider when we are bringing this work to our district. So I think if you haven't heard of culturally responsive education, it's kind of when theory meets practice, and you are able to see results as a result of applying all those things that we know to be right, how to value what children bring, how to see them as learners, and how to build on those assets. He actually gives us the questions and tools to actually create that context that our students so deserve. So I'll stop talking with that.
That was great. Thank you, Dr. Williams, so much. Okay, next I'm going to go with Gunnar.
Thanks, Lindsay. Gunnar Guttormsen, and math coach in the Kelso School District. I am privileged enough to work with closely with both people that Dr. Williams mentioned earlier. So in Southwest Washington here, we like to share secrets and strategies. So we don't have to, we steal greatness instead of inventing mediocrity. So, well, I know Noah's going to speak today, but I want to acknowledge the partnership that I have with Noah in this work. And we've done great partnering and working and learning with Dr. Stembridge. My focus in mathematics is breaking down the gatekeeping of that math is traditionally within the United States. So that cultural I guess, push against how we teach mathematics, how we allow students to access mathematics. Dr. Stembridge's work has helped me think about, not only that most important question within his framework of what do we want students to understand, but how do we want them to feel? And just in that question, thinking about how students experience mathematics helps us slow down. It helps us slow down and think about how students are engaging with their mathematics. And back to what Dr. Williams mentioned about context, helping us to really, as mathematics teachers, understand that if our students don't understand that context, then we are not building that understanding of mathematics upon anything. And one term that I've started using lately is we're working to make it sticky. We want those math concepts and those understandings about the world and how we can use mathematics to understand the world around us and how they're meaningful and purposeful in life. We want to build on their experiences. So knowing who our students are is the critical component to connecting how they feel with the mathematics experience. And I truly believe that's how we're going to get better in our math instruction, K-12.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gunnar. Okay, Noah, how would you describe this culturally responsive education model?
Awesome, thank you. Hello, so I'm Noah Hall from Kelso High School. I'm an English teacher, and just like everybody else said, I'm honored to be here. As far as me, I would describe CRE as a framework that we're going to be using in order to make sure that all our students in our school and our classroom feel like they belong in the school first and foremost. We're going to be using or leveraging their life experiences, their values, their culture in order to create on-ramps onto whatever we're trying to teach. Because just like with anybody else, our students are not going to engage with something that they cannot see themselves in, right? I'm a 30-year-old man. If I don't see value on something, I will check out. If you're 15, you will definitely check out if you cannot see the value, if you cannot see yourself in what you are learning. The other thing I will say here is we're using CRE to close opportunity gaps. When looking at our students, looking at who is in certain classes, who are in our higher level classes, who are in our lower level classes, we want to make sure that we're giving all of our students opportunities to feel like they can stretch themselves, that they can go into classes that demand more rigor and know that they have the support to do that and that they belong in those classes. So when I think of CRE, that's what comes to my mind. That's what we're trying to do here at Kelso.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, on to my Kent teacher team. I'm going to go ahead and start with Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Helmer. I'm a first-year teacher in the Kent School District teaching second grade. And I was in a residency with Dr. Stembridge in February. What I would want to say about CRE is that it is about engagement and allowing our most vulnerable students to engage in the learning opportunities that we are putting forth. So during the residency, it got me thinking about who are my most vulnerable students. In different units, there are different students that come to mind. And so framing my lessons and assessments so that they are accessible to all students, but especially for those vulnerable students. And with that, creating a classroom culture that is inclusive and consistent for all my students so that we build it all together and everyone has equal cultural fluency within the room. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. And Anna.
Hi all. My name is Anna Zimmerman. I am a colleague of Liz. We work on the same second grade teacher team. I teach second grade dual language at Kent Elementary. So I also had the experience of going through the residency with Dr. Stembridge, and Liz and I, as well as another colleague from our second grade team, worked with Dr. Stembridge to plan a lesson, which then turned into a unit. So I'll talk a little bit about what we were working on. We started working on a narrative writing unit using Dr. Stembridge's planning questions, using his big picture questions. And then by the end, we were working on using these planning questions and these big picture questions to plan our students' learning around since time immemorial, which is our, lots of you will know, our curriculum for learning about the Indigenous people of Washington State. So I would describe the learning that we did about Dr. Stembridge's approach as a framework for engaging students' cultural capital and competencies in education. Like Dr. Stembridge said, identities for our students are not a barrier, but an asset for their learning. And I think that Noah said this, or Gunnar said it as well. Knowing who they are is really, really important for that, getting to know our students. So we're working on moving education from more of a prescriptive experience for our second graders to a transformative experience where their identities and their interests and their experiences are reflected, and they gain a really deep understanding and buy-in of our content. So yeah, we really enjoyed our residency, and we're working towards approaching a lot of our learning in second grade from this framework for everything that we do.
Awesome. It'll be interesting to hear how you guys collaborate and how that works sort of with a team. That's great. All right, and Angela.
Hi, my name is Angela Boston, and I am a 7th year teacher. I teach English Language Arts at Kent Lab Academy. My academy, we used to be Kent Phoenix Academy. This is our first year in combination with the other district academy. So now we are becoming a new school, which has a lot of exciting opportunities that come along with it. If I get distracted, I apologize. My desk is in front of a window and there is an event involving drums happening at the park across the street. So I did not count on that, but it is a weekend, so that makes sense. So when I just got to meet Yemi 2 months ago, so I'm pretty fresh into his perspective, but it came at a really good time for me. I feel like I had a great graduate school experience. It was very equity focused. I had to read a Lisa Delpit book before we even started the program. So I've had a lot of these ideas inside me for a while, but entering the real teaching world, there's a lot of traditional frameworks that you're like, oh, okay, I guess this is the way teaching works. But then you get little extra things like, oh, and also you're supposed to build relationships. Oh, and also it should be strengths-based and not deficit-based. And so what I appreciate about Yemi is that his perspective kind of brought it all together. And it's like, oh, this is just good teaching. This is a list of the elements of good teaching and like a way to make sure you're not leaving anything out as you're planning and thinking about your teaching, instead of having well, this is how teaching usually looks, and we're going to add this and we're going to add that and maybe take that out, and it becomes a Jenga tower. So if you're planning through a CRE lens, then you're planning for good teaching. And I think that is even more important. The kids I'm accustomed to working with at KPA used to say, in every classroom, there are 1 or 2 kids falling through the cracks. We are where they fall to. We catch them. And every single kid benefits from good teaching, but some kids are sitting on that razor's edge of not having the privilege to get by on bad teaching. Some kids are gonna thrive on teaching that isn't great, but a lot of kids, it's really easy for them to bottom out without that privilege cushion. So good teaching is for every kid, but it's more important for some kids. And so that's the way I think about it.
Awesome, Angela. Yeah, really some thoughts in there, you know, not being able to survive bad teaching is really an interesting way to look at that, you know. It's obviously not a kid problem, right? I love that. Okay, we're going to move on to question number 2. And question number 2 is to describe how your work has been impacted and changed. So what part of this work are taking root for teachers, for building admin, for district admin, for systems? So kind of in your perspective and in your role, what part of that is really starting to spread roots throughout your system? So I'm going to stop share again. And I'm going to actually start this one with Noah.
Okay, so for me, a couple of things here. So looking at CRE, it has made me look at my teaching, look at who is being successful in my class, who is struggling in the class, and trying to identify why that is first and foremost, and how that has changed my teaching in a way. This is my 6th year teaching, and I think sometimes there are certain frameworks or ideas that we get early on in our teaching. I know for me, if I had something like 2 years ago that worked for like one of my ELO students or certain students, I would keep that. That would be one of my gems. And I would say, this works, so I'm going to use this every time. And by doing this work, I've learned that just because something worked for one student does not mean that it's going to work for another student. And you have to be making sure that you're doing the work every year, that you're getting to know each of your students, that you're learning what they value, what they experience, and that you are bringing that to the classroom, that you're utilizing that and not just putting kids into a box. And that was one thing that this really helped me learn and to move forward with my teaching and just to become a better teacher overall. Another thing that I would say here, as a district as a whole, as a school as a whole, we are looking at this as well, and we are learning to create that culture to allow our school to believe things like, like mathematics, or you don't necessarily need mathematics. It's a great quote from the book. Mathematics needs you, right? English needs you. We need engineers. Engineering doesn't necessarily, like you don't need that, right? But they need you in order to do this. And we're trying to instill that into our students, that yes, you can get by without English, you can get by without Shakespeare, you can get by without calculus, but they cannot survive without you. So we are trying to make that a building thing so that our students have that culture, they have that belief instilled in them going through high school, and building that family dynamic, because our slogan is "We are Kelso," and we're solidifying what that means in the classroom and outside the classroom. And that has helped propel some of our students to do better and to take those risks and to take on more rigorous courses, because they know that we care about them and that we are going to support them in that process. So.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm sitting with I've read this book so many times and I've had people say that quote so many times, but for some reason it really hit me, the importance of being needed and how much that can, I'm like, I don't know why it suddenly hit me that like how much that can bring to just a person's self-esteem and ability and want to be in, is to feel needed in every situation. And I'm like, got the chills, even though I've heard that like 10 times. When Noah said it, I don't know. That's pretty awesome. All right, Gunnar, if you would please also, what pieces are taking root for you?
It's Noah's radio voice. I get the opportunity to not only think about my coaching and leveraging teacher thought and reflection and practice. So going back to that question is, how do we want students to how do we want them to feel in the experience is prioritized alongside what do we want students to understand. Within mathematics, I truly believe it's one of the most difficult subjects to teach, for a multitude of reasons. And it's also one of the most difficult for students to learn because of those same reasons. So that the anxiety that's around mathematics in general, and we perpetuate that as a culture. So when I can help teachers think about how their students are experiencing or engaging, just the simple fact of what is our balance of talk time? Who's really doing the cognitive load? Who is thinking about, who is offering their thinking, and who is valued in their thinking within that space of thinking and sharing mathematics. We try to tell students that it's okay to make mistakes, but until we actually provide those opportunities for that to occur, that will mean nothing. Students will not, until they feel that, until they try something on and learn from that and have that, on a regular basis and with each other and share those experiences. And they're excited when they help another student make a connection. If we're not providing those opportunities, then we will not be there. Because of past roles and the confidence that I have with my peers in our district, including administration, I had the opportunity to get policymakers to think about our systems differently. We've been able to do some things like detracking and removing remediation and rather implementing support, some things that I know that are going on in Camas, and we're kind of following in their footsteps. So again, a great call out to some educators that are in Camas. But in that middle position role that I have, not only is that regular effect for teacher practice, but also helping administrators and decision makers think about structures, master schedules that support that work has been really how it's helped my thinking and also in my clarity of communication on both parts.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for talking about the system and how those supports can really make a difference. Great. Actually, we are going to move on to question 3 now. And question 3 is, how do you grow this work and sustain it over time? And again, kind of thinking about your spot in the system, how do you keep that going? I'm going to start this one with Angela.
I was excited about this question because like Noah said, sometimes you try something with one kid and it works and you're like, okay, this is the good thing. But those individual concrete ideas aren't always transferable. They don't always fit every situation. And I think when forward motion like this becomes about, well, what does it look like? What is the concrete? Too much. It's really easy to get overwhelmed, especially this year, and let things just fall away. And it's like, well, I had this great idea where we were going to do this thing every week, but then we had a fire drill and everything went to heck. So for me, the answer to this is to lead from your values. Lead from a student-centered approach. What do I want my students' education to look like? How do I want them to feel? Why am I a teacher? Why is this something that matters to me? And when you're centered in that, whatever techniques and strategies you pick up and put down are going to reflect that. Thank you, Yemi. Let's see, if you stay centered on why you're teaching, these strategies prioritize themselves. I'm thinking about, I have never felt super comfortable with traditional grading systems. And starting from my 2nd or 3rd year teaching, I was trying out I tried standards-based grading. It did not work for me. But instead of just saying, okay, well, I'll go back to points and A, B, C, D, I was like, okay, well, I got to try something else because my integrity tells me that this doesn't work. So I kept looking, and now I'm in sort of a conference-based grading system that makes sense to me. And so I think the more we can stay centered in our own integrity and why we do this work and what our goals are, like, keep bringing in information, and some of it's going to stick and some of it's not, but you're going to move in the right direction.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'd also like to ask this question of Charlene, kind of thinking about that district perspective that you have. How are you thinking that this work can grow and sustain over time?
So at a district level, equity work is very important to us. And someone alluded earlier to the detracking of the mathematics work and those kinds of things. And one of the tools we geek out with that Dr. Stembridge introduced to us was the cognitive rigor matrix. And actually, as a result of that detracking work, fixing a system doesn't necessarily change people's views and values, right? So you can change schedules, you can change curriculum, but you cannot necessarily change hearts and minds with that. And so we have some teachers who are rolling really well with the new detracking model, but then there are still others who are, not quite on board yet. And so our math coach is going to use the cognitive rigor matrix to just kind of unpack and prioritize, well, what are some of the key learnings and experiences students should have in this one particular class that people are concerned about. So just continuing to go back to those tools and use them as refreshers and reminders of our values, of why we are doing what we are doing, is one piece of that. And the other, you know, as an administrator, just continuing to create the container for teachers to collaborate around this work through some of the modules we're developing, continuing to invite Dr. Stembridge, especially if Sue Anderson gives us yet another opportunity for residency, but continue to create the container for teachers to come together and collaborate around this work, I think is just going to be essential. So in our last lab, someone mentioned, you know, it being on the calendar and the scope and sequence for our learning as a district, not something that we just talk about, but something that we pencil in and make sure happens.
Great, thank you so much. And I was wondering if Elizabeth might be able to share kind of from that teacher perspective, that new teacher perspective, you know, how do you got a long time to sustain this work.
Yeah, definitely. For me, when I was thinking about growing this practice, I thought about reflection and how that has been a piece of my first year with a mentoring program that Kent School District has, and also with my team. We are discussing in PLCs what worked, what didn't work. And I think something that I have added into my own self-reflection is thinking about who was able to get on the on-ramp and who was not. And specifically finding those students and thinking about how I can change my practices to fit them better. And also wondering about their culture and background outside of school and outside of academics, and how that plays a role in my classroom, because that is something that continues to change over time. And I need to continue changing my perspective of my students over time. So those are ways that I am able to grow this practice.
Awesome, thank you so much. All right, we are going to move on to question 4. And question 4 is just, what are your next steps, your personal next steps? You guys have all been through the residencies and you're reflecting. I think this is a really interesting question as well, knowing that some of you just finished residencies, some were in February, some were even earlier in the fall, and just kind of thinking on that path where you all are at. I'm gonna start this one with Anna, please.
Yeah, so Liz and I did our residency in February. And like I think somebody said earlier, we really centered planning with our team, centering the planning questions and the big guiding questions that Dr. Stembridge provided. We found that that was really powerful for the unit that we planned surrounding what it means to be Indigenous and moving students towards understanding their own cultures and being advocates and seeking justice as they go forward. So we've decided, as we're looking at next year, especially after this very unique year, we're thinking about what do we want second graders to know coming into second grade, and what do we want them to know leaving second grade. So we're working as a team to plan through that using those big ideas and enduring understandings. You know, 3 to 5 years after our students leave our classrooms in every subject, what do we want them to know in math and reading and social studies and science? What do we want them to be able to do, and what do we still want them to find value in? And so I think once we, you know, define those, we're working on that as a team. Once we define those things, that's when we move on to the next step, like Liz was saying, which is getting to know our students, because every single year our students change. Our classrooms fluctuate and change in different ways, and we want to make sure that our teaching and our planning is responsive to our students' identities, their things that they enjoy, the ways that they're engaged. So yeah, just working as a team to make sure that we, first of all, understand what we want students to know, what we want them to find value in, what we want them to feel, And then, like somebody said, taking that theoretical idea of what we want them to be able to do and matching it with the experience that they're bringing, the identities they're bringing. So that's the project that we're working on now, and we'll work on through the summer. And we really just find a lot of value in these guiding questions that were provided by Dr. Stembridge.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I'd also like to hear from Noah. What are your next steps?
All right, so we have a few things that we're going to be doing. For me, I'm going to be taking on the freshman AVID class next year. So right now I'm meeting with a lot of the students at the middle school, getting to talk with them, getting to know them. And what we're trying to do is introduce them to some of those higher level AVID students as well, because what we want to do is build that family, because as we've been talking about, we know that if students feel like they have a space where they belong, they have that culture already built within the school, they perform so much better. And it gives me an opportunity, I'm excited because I get to work with these students for 4 years. I get to build those relationships. I get to give them that extra support and help kind of stretch these kids and you know, lead them towards a more rigorous path if they so choose. So I'm excited for that for sure. I'm excited to be able to work with them. We're also going to be doing a book club with Kelso and maybe Longview as well. We're going to be doing culturally responsive education in the classroom and CAFs. And you know, Dr. Williams made a good point here. She said, you know, you can't always change somebody's, you know, hearts and minds, but we can start having these conversations as a school. We can, you know, get that space together for people to come to talk if they want to. Having our PLCs, speaking about how we can change this as a school culture. Maybe not everybody gets on board, but even if it's 1 or 2 teachers slowly over time, you know, that's slowly changing the culture of our school, making it to where we're one unit, and wherever a kid goes, right, they know that they're going to get the same type of treatment. They're going to feel that same sense of unity, that same sense of community in the classroom. And that's something that I think is worth working towards for sure. So I'm excited to be able to lead that and have the teachers come and talk. And we're also going to be doing Gunnar and I are going to partner and do a equity in your framework training for our superintendent or principal. So like our supervisor staff in a sense. And I'll be leading that equity piece of that, and Gunnar will be taking the framework more. And Gunnar, do you want to speak to that at all?
Sure. So in that partnership, so you know, Noah's the equity specialist and helps is going to help our principals develop that equity lens when they're looking at instructional practices and even thinking about their systems, hopefully. And then I get to connect that to our instructional framework, which is the CEL framework. You know, along that, and Noah kind of touched on that, is starting to build that capacity. There's here's a document that was shared in Math Fellows this last week, and actually David, who is here, him and I had the opportunity to be in small group and talk about that. But there's a piece in there. It says many mathematics teachers newly open to taking up teaching for social justice are rushing to try curriculum in their classroom where the students look at racialized violence through the mathematics lens. Mathematics lessons that focus on understanding social and racial injustices are an important piece of the broader struggle for justice. However, if we as teachers simply take an activity and implement it in our classrooms without first doing the self-reflective work to understand how we are all impacted by racial trauma, then we may not be able to engage with the lesson in ways that are positively impactful for students. So when I think about this in my own readiness, and Noah and I were just talking about this yesterday afternoon, is about 3 years ago, I had an epiphanal moment that really helped me pursue what I don't see. What I don't see is a white cisgender male. And so I am aggressively pursuing those things that I don't see so that I can see them and hopefully help others make adjustments in their instructional practices to be more inclusive for our learners. So Noah's and my work are really about creating that interest in self-reflection, because we know that if we create enough opportunities that we will start to grow capacity within the Kelso and possibly Longview School District to have more interest, to have more individual pursuits. And the more people that we can get, the more educators that we can get to understand and see the importance of their own learning in affecting what they do for how they plan for their children, how they think about their children and understand their community, we know that our kids are going to benefit. So trying to create those more opportunities for people to understand that or connect with that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to move on to question 5, which is our last question. And I'm actually going to go through the whole panel, the entire panel, to have them answer this question, because I think it's really, again, kind of like I talked about in the beginning, that one piece. I will tell you that there's not a lot of professional development, because I live in a professional development world, that I insist my husband participate in. But because, sort of what Dr. Williams said, this is the real deal, this is the thing. And I want him to go back to his school, where both of my children have gone and will go. And I want him to be able to talk about this to his colleagues. And I want him to be able to start using what he's getting for those kids on Monday. So what is one piece of advice, starting point, or the most impactful takeaway that you would share with another educator in your role who is just beginning to implement or think about culturally responsive education and Dr. Stembridge's model? So I think it's kind of, I can't remember now who was saying it, but that idea of like, there are so many things, and how do I pick out the pieces that help me launch. I also think that sometimes the farther away from this thinking, the more overwhelming it can be to start out with that shift. So what's the thing to get people, the on-ramps for the educators? How about that? Okay. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and actually I'm gonna start with Angela for this one.
Cool. So I was listening to Gunnar talk, and I actually added to my notes for this question, and I'm shifting a little bit. Originally, I had kind of what I talked about at the top, good teaching is good teaching, talking about sort of the privilege cushion and how some kids struggle with being able to survive bad teaching. But I want to shift to the idea of vulnerability. I was talking to my administrators the other day because one of my APs sat in on the residency I was in. And she was saying, okay, well, step one is we got to make sure our teachers know their students. And I was thinking about who of my colleagues is good at this, who is struggling with this. And I kind of came to the takeaway that teachers who have trouble getting to know their students have trouble sharing themselves. And the more comfortable we are with our own fallibility, and the more willing we are to share that with our students, the more willing they are to share themselves with us. Because knowing your students' culture isn't just, like knowing when their holidays are. It's knowing them as individuals with so many different identity facets. And the only person who can share that with you is them. So I would say that is a starting point. And if you're thinking about therapy, it's a great way into vulnerability. Brene Brown, also a great way into vulnerability. But that's where I would start.
Thank you so much. Anna, what is your one thing?
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Angela. That's so true. And that's what I was thinking about is like, we have to get to know our students, and we have to know them beyond what Dr. Stembridge, I remember saying, the surface level of culture. A lot of times when people are just starting to think about culturally relevant education, I know for me, when I was first starting to think about it, it was very much so, what do you visibly see? Or what are the things that come up the most if you are thinking about a certain identity? But there's really, food, fashion, festivities, like Dr. Stembridge just said. But it's so much more than that. And I think, for me, visualizing, once I get to know my students, visualizing a classroom where they have their cultures represented, visualizing them buying into the learning and showing themselves through their learning and being curious and wanting to pursue further learning because they have this buy-in through who they are. That's my starting point always. So you have to get to know them. And then for me, I like to, have that visual in my mind, start thinking about that. And then once you get to know them, and once you ask yourself those big planning questions, then you can start to synthesize those things. But I just really love what Angela said, getting to know them as whole people. And I think, in my classroom, we talk a lot about how we want to treat others the way that we want to be treated. If we know ourselves and we, are vulnerable with our students, and we think about how would I want to be represented in a classroom? What would a transformative experience look like for me and my identities? That's a good place to start as well.
Thank you so much. All right, Elizabeth.
For me, my biggest takeaway was the question, how do you want them to feel? And I have used this in my classroom in many ways. And the most recent way was when we started 3-digit numbers in 2nd grade. All year, math has been a struggle. I've noticed that to me, my students seem scared of numbers, scared of talking about place value, scared of 1s and 10s, because 1st grade was cut off early for them. So this fear is something I wanted to tackle finally when we moved into 3-digit numbers. After working all year, we've done adding and subtracting 2-digit numbers. And so with me thinking that they were afraid, we started out the unit just by brainstorming what we know about hundreds. And I knew that I wanted them to feel excited and brave. Those are the things that I was hoping that they would feel when we talked about 3-digit numbers, because I knew they could do it. So when we started brainstorming about it, immediately, because they got to have buy-in in the first lesson and share what they knew, they were so excited and they were brave. And we got into 4-digit numbers on the very first day because they brought it up. And so they talked about 1,000 and how all the hundreds, how many hundreds are in 1,000. And then we went back and went down to 100, how many 10s are in 100. And students were spewing really big facts that I didn't realize that they would know. And so it was really exciting for me. And I think that the students were able to feel excited and brave with 3-digit numbers just from the most simple activity of a discussion. And I took notes on the board. And so that took up a whole day's worth of math lessons and really got them ready to tackle those numbers and use them productively in adding and subtracting.
That's so great. What a great example. Thank you, Elizabeth. Awesome. Okay, we have done Noah.
So one piece of advice I would give somebody coming into this work is I would say, come in with the right mindset. Sometimes I hear teachers will say things like, this sounds like it's going to be hard work, or this is going to be really difficult, or something to that level. And really, you can't allow yourself to get overwhelmed, because this isn't necessarily harder work. I'm going to say teaching in itself is hard work, regardless how you're doing it. Teaching is difficult, but it's doing the work better. I think, like, when I look at my workload before I started with CRE and after, it's about the same amount of work. The only difference is that I feel like I'm more effective. And once you start getting into the framework, once you start working on it, once you start practicing, because just like with anything, when you first start, it's not going to go well. You're going to do these lessons, they're not going to go well. But I promise you, your students are going to recognize that you are trying to bring them into the lesson. And maybe it didn't go perfectly, but they see themselves in it. So even when you fail, the students see that you're trying, that you are valuing them, and they're going to come back that next day and they're going to try again with you, right? Because they see that you're giving them that chance. They see that you are trying to work with them, and they're going to work with you every time, especially if you've built those relationships. So that would be my advice. Go in with the right mindset. Go in there with the intent of making it known that you need your students in order to help make this lesson work. This is something between all of us. And I think that's a great place to start. It's better work. It's not harder work.
That is great. I love the way you put that as well. Okay, Gunnar.
I would prefer to go before Noah.
Well, this is the last question, so sorry.
Absolutely know your students. Absolutely know your students, and think about how, what can you do to provide personal connection to what you want them to learn for each student. And that's overwhelming for a lot of the new teachers that I work with. So again, back to a conversation Noah and I were having yesterday, it's being aware of the culture of our students. So not just who they are as individuals, but the culture. We have to stay up. You know, teaching, where my world is mostly middle school and Noah's is high school, there is some parallels, but knowing what the pop culture is, get into it, dig into it, even if we may not be the biggest fan, but we have to know what they're interested in. And we can do that through knowing our kids, but then being thoughtful about what lessons, what lesson structures, what context we're putting in front of them, or how can we tweak even what's part of our curriculum or the context of a problem, just so that they're more interested. That's what I would say. Know your students, connect them to the learning.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Charlene, if you can round out our panel, that would be great. Beginning and end. Awesome.
Well, thank you. You know, Dr. Stembridge said that this has been one of our hardest years. And I don't think of any profession that's just been as hard as teaching. And just commend all the work that you do. And as an administrator in a district, from this perspective, you know, and this work, I would ask that administrators stay engaged and model the practices that we want from our staff in terms of really leaning into this work and creating capacity in it. So, you know, participate in those book studies or those residencies, or in whatever form this work evolves in your system. Be fully present so you can be fully supportive of the work, even though Dr. Stembridge doesn't acknowledge you because you're an administrator. Know that you are still loved. But seriously, you know, to truly stay engaged, and to support, but get out of the way, because, you know, teachers just really need to know that we are behind them and that we're going to do whatever it is to clear the barriers and to create the opportunities for them to do this work.
Thank you so much. That was great. All right. Thank you to our great panel. I think that we took away so much from that. And I'm really thankful and excited about what others are going to be able to go out and do.
It was just great connecting with Kendra, and just the wrestling we do as administrators, you know, how to best roll out this work and get people on board. One of the things that we ended our discussion with, it was in our lab on Thursday, Dr. Stembridge made the statement about, you know, as administrators, if we're really engaged in instructional leadership, the importance of, you know, being in the classroom, teaching some lessons, and just, you know, coming alongside our teachers. And so we talked about, as administrators, co-planning with teachers, and then co-teaching, and then debriefing, just to keep us close and engaged in this process with them. So I thought that was a powerful takeaway. So anything else, Ms. Kendra?
No, I would just say I definitely appreciate Charlene's wealth of knowledge and her expertise for a young blood like me. And make sure you send me your number, because we definitely got to keep in touch.
Thank you so much. Great. All right, a representative from our instructional coach group, if you could share, you know, big ideas, reflections.
Yes, I'll speak to this one. So I have the privilege to be in with the instructional coaches, and some of the things that we went over dealt with what works well to create and support opportunities for CRE. And we did a bunch of ideas here, so I'll take a couple of snapshots. One of the things that we were talking about was this idea of you need to get a second pair of eyes in your room, right? When you're teaching, sometimes you don't always see the mistakes that you make as a teacher. So having that person that you can co-plan with, or you can have come in and record you, go back and kind of watch what you are actually doing in the classroom. Because sometimes as teachers, we feel like we're just in there killing it. And then we go back and look at it, it's like, oh man, not all my kids are engaged in this. Some of my kids are definitely falling off here. And having that, being vulnerable in that sense, being willing to sit back and speak with somebody about your teaching is a big deal. And I think that is one of the first steps to putting CRE into practice, is being able to look at your own flaws as a teacher and try to rectify those. The other things that we were talking about was how to address teachers that may not want to engage in things like productive struggle or student talk. And I definitely felt that as a teacher. I know sometimes, especially early on, this idea of allowing students to have control in your room is terrifying, right? To lose that sense of control as a teacher. But we have to be willing to do that. We have to allow students to struggle. And Yemi came into our group for a little while and spoke to that, and he did an amazing job. But ultimately it comes down, if we do not allow our students to struggle, if we do not teach that when they're young, I mean, they don't carry that with them to middle school and high school. And it gives them fewer opportunities to engage in more rigorous work, to really stretch themselves, because they never learned that grit, right? So we have to allow our students to have that productive struggle, and to be able to speak out in your room. Simply because if students don't feel like they can engage, that they have a voice in a room, there's no emotion attached to that. If there's no emotion attached to what you are learning, to what you are teaching, students will not engage. The last thing that I want to highlight here, Amy pointed out, and she was talking about adding more support into classes, so that fewer students are being taken out of class for behavioral issues. Because usually a kid is misbehaving in a class because they cannot access what you are trying to teach. They cannot connect to that. By taking a kid out of the classroom, all you're doing is increasing that gap. Now they don't even know what you're teaching, so they definitely cannot access what you are trying to get to them. So it just starts a cycle. And so those were some of the three main points that we were talking about. And it was amazing to get to listen to some of the instructional coaches to speak about the work that they do. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing out, Noah. Great. And from one of our teacher groups.
I can speak for us.
Thank you.
We talked about how in the large group discussion, relationship was something that wasn't emphasized as much as getting to know the students. And so we discussed how relationship is a key factor in culturally responsive education. And it's something that Dr. Stembridge did stress during the residency, but we just hadn't discussed it as much as other factors today. And so we also discussed how difficult it has been to get to know our students through this environment, and how providing a lot of opportunity for students to respond in different ways has allowed students to participate. Another thing that came up was thinking about how when we say something worked for us and we want to keep it every year, and how that was something that we talked about should not happen. We talked about how some teaching practices, if they work for us, it is something that we can keep going toward, like small groups, mini lessons, and then small groups, mini lessons, and then partner discussions. Those are things that we can continue using every day. But it's the actual questions that we're posing during those discussions and the activities that we're using to bridge those gaps and provide the on-ramp. Those are the things that we need to change every day and every year as we get to know our students.
So that idea of like keeping the basic kind of structures and strategies, but always being ready. I think about it, kind of like that Play-Doh. I still have my Play-Doh, but I'm going to mold it in different ways, but it's still there. That makes sense. Thank you everyone for sharing out. Okay, well, now we have the privilege to hear from Dr. Stembridge again, some follow-up. I love this part because this is where he kind of does that thing for us and reflects on kind of what he heard and other last thoughts that he wants to leave with us for today. So I'm going to stop share and turn it on over to Dr. Stembridge.
And what I want to do is I'm going to talk just for a couple of minutes share make a couple of connections based on what I saw and heard in the breakout groups. And then I would love to end our time with a little bit of Q&A. And I wouldn't suggest that I would have all the answers to the questions that you could ask, but just to give ourselves a chance to think specifically about some of the questions that are on your mind right now. So a couple things, let me share my screen here. Just want to put the mental model back up. A couple things I want to highlight. And let me see, also, I want to give you a link for those of you who don't have the book. Let me give you a link to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the story of the 6 themes. I probably started thinking specifically about culturally responsive education in 2008. When I went to, that's when I went to Teachers College. I was working at the National Center for Restructuring Education, Schools, and Teaching, NCREST, at Teachers College, a center that was started by Linda Darling Hammond. And I read the book Dream Keepers, and that was big. Gloria Ladson-Billings. Gloria Ladson-Billings is really probably the first person. She wasn't saying culturally responsive teaching, she was saying culturally relevant pedagogy, but she was probably the first person who was bringing from the idea of multiculturalism. Some of us are seasoned enough to remember the multiculturalism era in education. And she kind of brought from multiculturalism this idea of culturally responsive education. And part of it was she was saying that multiculturalism was really good in terms of the diversity piece, but it was lacking in terms of the critical consciousness piece, the piece that prepares our students to engage with texts in a more productive, well, I'm not going to say productive, but in a more productive, but in a way that centers their own agency. So she would say, I think she would say that before, in the era of multiculturalism, there was a rightful emphasis on diversifying text. But with culturally relevant pedagogy, as Gloria Ladson-Billings was first starting to articulate it, she was asking us to think about how do we put our students inside of the text? How do we give our students tools to be able to unpack and ascertain from text critical meanings that they could connect to and relate to their own lives? And I think part of what she was saying was that if we cannot make the case that a text that we put in front of our students gives students the opportunities to find that critical application, to see themselves, to understand the value of this text, not just in their academic learning, but in their out of school life as well, then the text itself may not be a worthy text. So, so a couple things here. I'm hearing I'm hearing Elizabeth Helmer talk a lot about on-ramps, and I love that. I appreciate her saying that, right? And so that's that first question. What do we want students to understand? What's that big idea that's going to have enduring value for our students? That, you know, a philosopher would say that once you come to understand something newly, you are not the same person as you were before. And so in every unit that we're teaching our students, we're giving them access to these big ideas that are going to change who they are. It's going to change their self-perception. It's going to change the way they make sense of the world around them. And we have to give our students multiple on-ramps and access points and doorways to connect to the big ideas. And so that's a big thing that I think that is crucial in terms of the planning piece. And in the book, you'll read more in chapter 4. That's where we talk about the dream exercise. And the dream exercise is the device that I use to unpack that big idea. But yeah, I did hear the question about relationships, and I appreciate that question. And that's one of our 6 themes. I was mentioning, right, that I was at Teachers College, and then I went from Teachers College to New York University. And at New York University, I was leading my own applied research center, the Center for Strategic Solutions. And there, two of my colleagues, they're like intellectual siblings of mine, Roe Aram and Chame Morales. We would spend a lot of time together, all former teachers, spending a lot of time together thinking about how do we convey this big idea of culturally responsive education to the teachers that we work with, that we support. And that's where those rooms where we would plan, for about a year, we would just spend all of our Fridays, every Friday, we would get together and just have these beautiful, back and forth conversations where we would, really try to flesh out this idea of CRE. And that's the room where the CRE themes were really born. And so relationships is one of those themes. But I want to just make sure that we're clear that when we're talking about relationships, we are talking, yes, about the relationship between student and teacher. That's a very important thing. But, I've said this before in different C-STEP forums that, as a Black person, I am sometimes uncomfortable when I see those viral videos of white teachers giving those, elaborate handshakes or doing those, really well coordinated dance routines with Black kids, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, okay, all right, that's cool. You know what I'm saying? Like, I love the, the super the groovy handshakes. And I like the, the videos where the teacher is dancing with students. But, really what I want to know is, does the quality of this relationship extend into your math instruction? Does the substance of this relationship extend into the ways in which you are helping your students to develop their voice as writers? Is the essence of this relationship useful to you in pushing students to think deeply in science and social studies and art and physical education? And so what I always like to remind us of, and I talk about this in chapter 3. Okay, and so did I already give you the link to chapter 3? Yeah, I gave you the link to chapter 3. Relationships is about establishing an authentic sense of trust and credibility between teachers and students. And this is where relationships kind of blends in with other themes. This is about, as was already said, I think Angela B said this, about being vulnerable. This is also about authentically being able to recognize the assets of your students. Here's the thing about assets that we talked about in residencies. If everyone from the residencies remembers, you are more likely to recognize the assets of people who share similar social and cultural backgrounds to you. The more similar a person is in terms of their social and cultural indoctrination, the more likely you are able to recognize their assets. Okay, so this is why all teachers have to be experts in identifying students' assets, because a powerful strategy for improving the interpersonal quality of relationship between teacher and student is the honest and authentic recognition of a student's assets. But it's not just about telling them that they have an asset, it's about designing a learning experience that leverages that asset in the interest of their engagement. So I want to give my students, based on the recognition of their assets, I want to give them the opportunity to use that asset to show their competence in school. That is hugely, hugely affirming of the interpersonal relationships between teachers and students. But here's the thing, folks. The real purpose of relationships is so that your students will see you as credible, so that when they are fashioning their own relationship with content, with math, with science, with reading, with writing, with physical education, with art, with social studies, when our students are forming their relationship with the content, you should be a trustworthy representative of what their authentic relationship with the content can look like. This is the whole point of relationships. Otherwise, relationships are thin. And I could maybe argue that you're doing the work of building relationships to satisfy your own ego and not to advance the more honorable, timely cause of further compelling your students to take those risks necessary to be competent and successful in school. And sometimes, right, when we talk about supporting the relationship between students and content, sometimes we're talking about supporting the relationship between students and the idea of school. Because sometimes you can have a kid, especially the middle school teachers in here. I don't know why anybody would ever choose to be a middle school teacher. Middle school kids are crazy, insane human beings, but it's not their fault. Developmentally, they're insane. That begs the question, why would an otherwise sane person choose to work with insane people? Well, I'll let you answer that question yourself. But here's the thing. At middle school, a lot of times the work is you've had kids who are already checked out from the idea of school. They've already made the decision that school is a place where they do not belong. And so when I think about this theme of relationship, what I'm efforting to do in my middle school classrooms is I'm efforting for my most vulnerable learners, I'm efforting to show them how they can have an authentic relationship with school. This also comes back, and I'm going to stop talking here, and hopefully there's some questions and some comments and some thoughts that we can have to wind down our time here. But this is also where, this is the reason why and I wrote about this in the book, the reason why I prefer the term responsive over relevant. I'm not mad at relevant, but for me, relevant is something that is more surface. Relevant is changing the names in a math problem from Mary and Joseph to Maria and Jose. Right? That's cool, but responsive, I draw on the work of Harry Rice, who's a research psychologist at the University of Rochester, and he talks about, and I'll put this in the chat, he talks about the building blocks of responsiveness are understanding, validation, and care. So when I'm asking that fifth question, what are the opportunities to be responsive? Really what we're asking is, in the course of instruction, not just in those, handshakes outside the classroom, not just in the counseling office, in the course of instruction, as students are taking those risks to engage, how can we design for ourselves and for the community of learners, how can we design opportunities for students to feel understood, validated, and cared for? That's the reason why you do a small group, right? You do a small group so that you can ask a question in the right way so that a student can take a risk, offer a response, and then have that response validated, understood, have people demonstrate to them, oh, I care about who you are as a thinker, and I care about how you're showing up today, and I'm demonstrating that by taking your engagement seriously. And so, I was doing a book talk earlier in the year, and someone said, well, you're calling that a CRE pie, but really it sounds like it's more like a casserole because all the pieces kind of blend together. And I was like, yeah, okay, I get that. I don't know how you'd make a casserole graphic for the book, but let's call it a CRE pie with casserole-ish qualities. And what I've learned is that the more you really get the themes, the less you see them as siloed, independent parts of a puzzle, and the more you see them as interdependent, blending pieces of the whole. So I'm going to stop there, and then I really would love to hear some questions, some comments, some connections, so that we can just kind of end our time in more of a discussion.
You can feel free to use the chat or turn your camera on and raise your hand, or raise your hand using the reactions. Any way you want to interact is fine.
I have a comment about student assets and really intentionally thinking about that because this week our second graders were selected that certain ones might be gifted students and high cap students, and we were asked to provide surveys answering questions about them and then listing their qualities. And for certain of my students, I realized that I knew a lot more about them and their assets than I had supposed. And so for one of my students, I realized that he is a competitor and he engages when we have class competitions and he always wins. It's rare that he would lose. And at other parts of the days, he is a space cadet and he is not listening and he is drawing. And so actually writing that down, that is when I realized how I can leverage that student's assets and change my practices to fit him better. And same goes for some other students that are very visual learners that are drawing all day and making art projects. They can really show their strength by providing their knowledge and showing it through visuals and concept maps. And I think they would be really successful at that more than writing it down in a paragraph.
Elizabeth, I'd like to build on that idea just in my own personal ideas of tracking students, moving away from that idea of identifiers as low and high students and helping teachers move away from low and high. And that idea of identifying students' assets helps me do that. So what are the assets? What are the scaffolds that students may need in some situations, and what assets can we capitalize on in other situations to promote learning? So thank you.
Dr. Stembridge, there was something we talked about on Thursday. I call them boulders. So the boulders in the system where we got to part the waters and go around them and hope we erode till they come downstream with us. But you were talking about, and now I can't remember, I know that it has the word interest in it, but that concept of making it in their best interest. If you could talk a little bit about that, how do we move those colleagues who seem to be boulders in our stream?
Yeah. And I'm also, let me see here. I'm also looking for one other thing. Many of you already have this. This is the folder that I use, my Habits of Mind folder. This is another tool that I use to help teachers to think more dynamically about assets. And so feel free to use that in whatever way makes sense for you. Yeah, the idea we were talking about on Thursday was the idea of entrance convergence, which is a critical race theory concept that was first brought by one of the parents of critical race theory. His name was Derek Bell. He was a law professor. And the idea of interest convergence is that there are times where people are unwilling to change their practices or even their beliefs unless and until they arrive at a point where they see that changing their practices and beliefs will benefit them personally. And, I was telling the group on Thursday that when I first started doing this work and going into schools and doing professional development, the great thing about teachers is that teachers are, they'll listen if they think that you're giving them something that's going to be useful to them. And really, the real thing that teachers do is they're kind of sizing you up consciously or non-consciously. They're trying to determine, do they think that you, this person who's offering professional development, could teach their class? That's really what teachers are doing on a certain non-conscious level. But I used to get really angry at teachers, and I'm going to keep it like a total buck with you all right now, right? I used to get really angry at white teachers who taught primarily racial, ethnic, minority classrooms, Black and brown kids, who were unwilling to evolve their practices because, obviously, right, like, I'm concerned about the well-being of these students and their communities. And I have a sense, I know that there are things that we could be doing differently. And I would have these teachers who would be so rigidly locked into their own practices and their own beliefs about their practices that they were unwilling to budge. And so I used to like fuss at them. And frankly, this is just me being forthcoming. There was a time when I even used to have like a bag of snappy one-liners in which I would try to shame them. And then I realized that doesn't work. They only dig in further. And then when I was really honest with myself, I thought to myself, no one's ever shamed me into changing my mind. People have sometimes shamed me into, being compliant, but I've never been shamed into a true shift in beliefs. But when I can work with the teacher, and even if I'm not able to give them my full argument for equity or culturally responsive education, when I'm able to work with a teacher, go into their classroom, sometimes it's just me teaching their kids. That's what chapter 5 is in my book. Chapter 5 are the promising practices that travel well, that I have used to go into classrooms where I have non-believing teachers. And I say, okay, you know what? I'm just going to do this thing. Just watch me. And then I go into the classroom and listen, the word that I have in my mind right now is humbling. Let's put it like this. It's a jarring experience to see someone come into your classroom and teach your students more effectively than you are. And if you do that, and then you don't grandstand afterwards, if you have an honest and authentic and vulnerable conversation where you unpack the learning experience, the teacher starts to get the idea that if I make this shift in my practice, it's going to make my life easier. Interest convergence. What becomes good for the teacher is also good for the kid. Now, here's the thing, folks. You ain't getting to heaven if the reason why you shift your practices and beliefs around teaching is to make your life easier. There's very little redeeming about that kind of shift. But I'm at the point in my career where I don't really care why you shift in ways that improve the opportunities for your students. I just want you to shift. And frankly, here's the other thing that happens. And, it happens in all kinds of classrooms with all kinds of racial and ethnic kids. But frankly, there's a little thing that I'll see with Black kids. I'll go into a classroom and a Black kid will look at me and they'll realize what I'm trying to do. They were like, oh, he's about to bring something more interesting into this class than what we usually experience. And I don't just see this in Black kids. I'll see this in a lot of kids. Kids, when they recognize that there is potentially an opportunity for a more engaging learning experience, they'll get on board. They get on board and they cooperate. And so that idea of entrance convergence, where sometimes in my opinion, and many people will disagree with me about this, but in my opinion, one of the ways to move people is you have to show them how this approach to planning and teaching and reflecting about your planning and teaching it makes their life easier. Because here's what we all know, folks. If you are, a 7th grade math teacher and none of your classes are engaged and none of your lessons are going over well, that affects every aspect of your life. That person's pet feels that. Their marriage suffers because of that. They don't hit as well in their weekend softball league because of that. Like every part of their life is affected by the struggle with a particular class or multiple classes to engage. So I have come to the point in my career where I think in terms of entrance convergence. Sometimes I'm not telling the teacher this is good for your kids. Sometimes I have to tell the teacher this is good for you. And again, I don't know how St. Peter's going to feel about that at the pearly gates, but my primary concern is about the well-being of the students who are in front of that teacher right now.
Thank you very much. There was a question in the chat from Brian about working in a school where he's not similar. And while he likes that, it doesn't necessarily benefit his students. So what's one simple strategy, next week to start building those relationships?
Yeah, so real quick, Brian, authenticity. Brian, unmute yourself real quick. Tell me, what do you teach? What's the subject?
I teach middle school English at Lewis and Clark Middle School, and we're probably, I'm 95% Hispanic, and we have a lot of first generation students. You know, and certainly this year, you know, some really difficult family situations where parents are working during the day and at night, you know, and you have to have a lot of understanding and grace in terms of completion of assignments, because, you know, you have middle school students watching younger kids at home, and et cetera, et cetera. And I, you know, I guess that's pretty much, I'm answering your question. There you go.
I want you to think about, you asked me for one thing you could do next week. All right. So,
yeah.
You know, yeah, so I'm answering your question. So I would say do a text analysis. Do a text analysis. And remember, a text is anything that can be interpreted. So do a text analysis of a song that you love. And it doesn't have to be a song that your students love. If you love country music, if you love folk music, all the better. Do a text analysis of a song that you love, and then have your students do a text analysis of a song that they love. And what you are doing is you are modeling your own authentic intellectual engagement with a text that is meaningful to you, and you're inviting your students to do the same. And when they pick those texts, these are opportunities, right? Every text that they pick is a window into their identity. It's a window into their community, right? And what you're looking to do is you're modeling for your students not only your skills, the analytical skills of pulling the text apart, right? Pulling out meaning from the text, but then you're also modeling your own personal connection to the song, which means you're giving your kids permission to analyze a text to which they have a personal connection to. If you can do that, you're going to create for your students an opportunity for them to be experts in front of you, and that's a chance for you to learn from them. It's a chance for you to ask questions, a chance for you to further make connections, again, between the idea of school and some of the tools that we're using to learn in our classroom, and the expertise and the assets that our students bring to school from outside. If you do that, I would love for you to send me an email and let me know how it goes. All right, so I'm going to put my email address in here. This is my email address. So if you do that, I would love to hear how that goes. Again, it doesn't matter if your kids like the music that you like. That's even better, right? If you're into country music, make it goofy. Bring some country boots in, a country hat, right? Or a cowboy hat, right? Like that's the whole point, because the more you model your connection, the more you're inviting them to model their authentic connection.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stembridge, and everyone for being here. Like I said, this is the one thing, right? This is the real deal. So I'm so excited you were able to be here. I put a link to a Padlet. If you have a minute, I would love for you to just leave a post. You know, what's the biggest takeaway? What's the thing that's really resonating with you? And know that you will get a follow-up email from Erin that will include an evaluation survey, a short one, so that we can continue to offer these leadership labs and continue to build on our presentation of them. You'll also receive clock hour information if you would like to get clock hours, and links to the recording, so you will be able to go back. I was just saying before we started, one of the things that I think is a really great thing about these is, even if the audience is small, I think some of these snippets, things that you could share with other people in the recording, is just a great resource to have. If you have any questions, if you're interested in a teacher residency, we are going to be doing quite a few next year. So if you are interested, reach out to us, Lindsay, at cstep-wa.org. And if you don't already have the CRE book, you should get it. It is great. So anything else? We're here, but that's the end of our session today. Thank you so much, Dr. Stembridge. If you have any goodbyes to say.
No, thank you, C-STEP. Thank you, OSPI. Thank you, all the teachers that I got a chance to learn with and work with this year. And good luck, finish strong this year. And again, on behalf of all of our students, thank you for all you do. I appreciate you.